Everybody, today we are in Unit 7, Day 10, and we're going to be talking about the Pacific theater of World War II. So we left off, Germany had been defeated, and now we're going to look at the Pacific, which things had been going on the Pacific throughout the war. But again, the major focus was not on the Pacific. We would really turn all of our focus on the Pacific as a result of beating Germany. So fighting Japan in the Pacific, you're going to see largely when we talk about the Pacific, we don't talk about the Allies. We talk about the United States because it was largely left up to the United States to take care of the war in the Pacific. After Pearl Harbor, Japan started seizing more control of islands in the Pacific, much of East Asia and Southeast Asia. By 1942, you'll see Japan occupied Korea, Eastern China, Philippines, British Burma, and Malaya, Indochina, the Dutch East Indies, and most Pacific islands west of the Midway Island. You can see there on that map that shows the Japanese Empire during this time. So they had grown quite a bit from 1941 when they had bombed us at Pearl Harbor. So what would be our strategy in the Pacific? Overall, it would be known as the island hopping strategy or the island hopping campaign, where basically we would fight to take one island at a time back from the Japanese. Now, this is going to be a very, very bloody form of fighting because the Japanese would fight literally to the death versus giving up an island. And that's what we're gonna grow to learn, is that this was a very, very bloody form of fighting. And the goal was to keep seizing islands until we got close enough to Japan where we could start doing air attacks on Japan. Another thing that we did was cut off Japanese supplies through using submarine warfare against Japanese shipping. You'll see that this submarine warfare against Japanese shipping would be very, very successful. It would put a ton of pressure on Japan when they weren't getting shipments of war materials and other things that they needed. Now, what was the Japanese strategy? They hoped to invade both Australia and Hawaii. And they hoped that eventually the United States would just accept their dominance in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, rather than continuing and conducting a really bloody and costly war to reverse the Japanese gains there. So basically their hope was, that we would just get sick of fighting and be like, you know what, Japan, we are fine with you having all that area out there. Obviously, they don't know Americans because we were not okay with that, especially after Pearl Harbor. Some leaders in the Pacific that you should know about: Douglas MacArthur. He's going to be a very, very important one. He's the supreme commander there, but also he is going to basically oversee all of Japan after World War II, and then be the lead general during the Korean War as well. You have Emperor Hirohito, who was the emperor of Japan, and you're going to see him as far as emperor. He was mostly just kind of a figurehead during this time. Tojo, who is the prime minister of Japan, who's pictured there at the bottom, he is the one that had the real power. So one of the early battles that would be a major turning point for the United States would be the Battle of Midway. We were able to defeat the Japanese at this battle. Midway is just a very, very tiny island out in the Pacific. There's basically nothing there except for an airstrip. But we were able to intercept and decode Japanese messages, basically almost surprise them, kind of like what they had done to us at Pearl Harbor. And we were able to heavily damage the Japanese fleet, 4 carriers and 300 planes being destroyed. And this is what officially started that island hopping strategy. Now, it's considered a turning point because at this point, the Japanese were no longer within striking distance of Hawaii, and this would be the end of any Japanese expansion in the Pacific. So we talked about them hoping to invade Hawaii and Australia. That would not happen after this. Now, Philippines in early 1942, you're going to see that Douglas MacArthur would be driven from the Philippine Islands. Remember, we talked about how we had turned the Philippines basically back over to the Philippine people. We still had military forces there. And again, they would be able to push us out of the Philippines in early 1942. Now, Douglas MacArthur, as he left there, he vows, "I shall return." That is what he said, "I shall return," and yes, he would. Now we have the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. This would be the largest naval battle in history, and which is pretty incredible to think about throughout all of history, and this is the largest naval battle. The Japanese would be defeated, and virtually their entire navy would be destroyed as a result of this. And this would also be the first time. You can see at the bottom there is a boat that has been hit and is on fire. This would be the first time that Japanese pilots would become kamikazes, which is basically they were doing suicide missions where they would take their planes and fly it into U.S. Boats. And again, if you think about it, because we destroyed their Navy in such a big way, that's really their only kind of choice they had left in fighting against our Navy was to fly planes into it. As a result of this, like I said, the U.S. would be triumphant. You have this famous picture there at the top. That is Douglas MacArthur there walking back onto the Philippines. And remember, he said he would vow to be back, and he was back. You have that very famous picture there of him, which, again, is about publicity more than anything, showing like, hey, I said I'm going to be back, and I am back. Next up, you're going to have the Battle of Iwo Jima. This would be fought to February, March of 1945. And when I said the Pacific, fighting there is very brutal. It's hard to describe how brutal the fighting in the Pacific actually was. This is going to see some of the fiercest fighting of the war because, like I said, the Japanese refused to surrender. They saw it as a dishonor to surrender, and they would rather fight to the death before surrendering and doing everything they can, including doing the kamikaze, the suicide type thing. They would rather do any of that than surrender and have that look bad on their honor. And in fact, you're going to see in a lot of these islands that we talk about, the only Japanese that are really captured are ones that, they might have got knocked out during the battle or that kind of thing. And we find them and they are still alive and they become prisoners of war. But otherwise, you're not going to see a ton of Japanese become prisoners of war during the war in the Pacific. So Iwo Jima, you can see there, a very, very small island, contained two important airfields. This battle would see some of the fiercest and bloodiest fighting of the Pacific War. You'd have 26,000 American casualties as a result of this battle and 18,000 Japanese dead or missing. And again, I said, you saw very, very few Japanese surrender. I mean, I think it was only around a couple hundred that you would take as prisoners of war, but this would be an American victory here. Also with the Battle of Iwo Jima, another thing you're going to see here is that one of the things the Japanese did on these islands is they built extensive tunnel systems throughout there. So I know with Iwo Jima, we spent days and days bombing Iwo Jima. Actually, we spent months bombing Iwo Jima before we did an invasion of Iwo Jima and later Okinawa that we'll talk about. And a lot of it was kind of ineffective because the Japanese had built all of these tunnels under the ground there, which caused massive issues because, we might come ashore and be like, oh, this isn't going to be bad. The bombings, pre-invasion bombings must have worked and that kind of thing. And then you'd be surprised by thousands of Japanese soldiers pouring out of these bunkers. Also with Iwo Jima, you'll get this famous picture right here of American troops raising the flag on top of the volcano there in Iwo Jima. There's a flag, a movie about this, Flags of Our Fathers. And also, if you ever have a chance to visit Arlington National Cemetery in Washington, D.C., they have a very famous statue that has recreated this moment right here. Next up, the Battle of Okinawa from March to July of 1945. The initial invasion of Okinawa would be the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific Theater. Again, this is going to be an American victory, but there is going to be a ton of costs associated with this. You'd have 160,000 casualties on both sides, up to 20,000 Americans and 77,000 Japanese dead as a result of this. Now, Iwo Jima and Okinawa would be very important because that gave us the airfields that we needed to be within striking distance of Japan. And even if we weren't close enough to striking distance, it gave us refueling that we would need to be able to do so. So again, these would be very important because now we could start a large-scale bombing campaign against Japan like we had done against the Germans that had been very, very successful. But again, I can't understate how bloody these battles were in the Pacific. They were incredibly bloody, as you can tell by the casualty counts there. You can see there the mountain here, the hills there that they would have to climb during this, and some of the results here from the Battle of Okinawa. I believe in that picture right there is actually Desmond Doss, who we'll talk about him right now. During the Battle of Okinawa, Desmond Doss, who was from Lynchburg, he was a combat medic and a conscientious objector, meaning that he did not believe in killing anybody during wartime, so he refused to carry a rifle or a gun or to shoot a gun during that. And because of that, he would be a combat medic. Now, he will achieve fame during the Battle of Okinawa, because during this battle, he saved the lives of 75 men during the battle. You can see, I believe that's him standing on top of this hill here, that he had to lower soldiers down during that. But again, he was able to save 75 men during this battle. For this actions, he would receive the Presidential Medal of Honor. You can see him there pictured with Harry Truman. And if you have had a chance or haven't had a chance, I recommend seeing the movie Hacksaw Ridge, which is based off his life and tells the story. And actually, in that movie, they had to cut out some of the parts of his story from World War II because the things that he did were so absolutely incredible. They thought that audiences actually wouldn't believe, that they would think that it was made up. Another good thing about that movie, Hacksaw Ridge, is it really shows how brutal the war was in the Pacific, and especially in Okinawa and other places. So very cool. Again, if you ever have a chance, if you're on 501, they have, that's known as Desmond Doss Memorial Highway, and you'll see some signage up there reflecting that. So after Okinawa, you're going to see a huge invasion force stood ready to invade Japan during that time. Basically, heavy casualties were feared. If you look at the other battles, we talked about how absolutely brutal and bloody that they were. We knew that that was probably going to be the result if we did an invasion of Japan. Now, going back some, starting in 1942, physicist Robert Oppenheimer and 100,000 people had been working in secret to develop the atomic bomb. The Germans had actually been working to develop an atomic bomb throughout the war as well. And actually, you're going to see a lot of Germans that had fled to the United States before the war got started. They were some of the people that actually helped in developing the atomic bomb here in the United States. And this atomic bomb would be successfully tested on July 16th, 1945 in New Mexico. You actually see that this was such a secretive project that Truman did not know about it until after FDR had died. He becomes president, and basically the Joint Chiefs of Staff say, hey, we need to meet with you and discuss this highly secretive project here that we have going on. And so Truman finds out about it, and now he's really left with the decision. We could do this invasion of Japan that would be very, very costly to human life on both sides, or we could be the first in history to use a nuclear weapon. Truman decides that it probably would be best to use the nuclear weapon because of how things had been going in the Pacific in each of those battles. So Truman would issue an ultimatum to Japan: surrender unconditionally or face utter destruction. And I have a little video here that talks about this, and this is something that people have debated throughout history since we dropped those atomic bombs on Japan, is were the nuclear attacks a proportional response, and was it morally right for us to do that? This video will raise and talk about some of those questions and talk about both sides of the issues, why Truman looked at this and felt like this was the best course of action necessary, but why other sides might say, hey, we don't agree with how this went about. So again, a lot of it depends on your philosophical and moral viewpoints on the atomic bomb. So again, Truman, he decides the fastest way to end the war is by dropping these atomic bombs. Our goal for this was to take out a couple military installations with this. Obviously, with the destruction of the atomic bomb, it's going to take out a whole lot more than that. Civilians, military, basically everything. So August 6th, the first atomic bomb is dropped on Hiroshima, Japan. We asked for surrender after that. The Japanese do not surrender. So on August 9th, another atomic bomb is dropped on Nagasaki, Japan. And after that, 6 days later, you're going to see that Japan agrees to surrender. As a result of the atomic bombs, you're going to have 250,000 die, military, civilians, the like die. And again, a lot of people die long-term from it, from the large exposure to radiation and that kind of thing as a result. Now, this would be the last time that you're going to see so far in history that nuclear weapons were used. And I think that since we saw the destruction and what they did, that's why you haven't had one used yet is because people are very leery and very scared of the results of this and what exactly it actually does. And that's why we fight so hard today to keep some countries from acquiring them that we're worried could be very, very reckless with an atomic weapon. You can see some of the pictures there of the results. I always thought that one there of the watch was very interesting because the watch stopped exactly at the time the atomic bomb dropped. The picture there of the stairs, that's actually where somebody was sitting and they were just completely incinerated as a result of the atomic bomb. You can see Nagasaki there. Again, if you just look out that picture of Nagasaki there and there's just barely anything left. It's just incredible the amount of destruction from that. I do have a picture here from a lady who was a school-age child during the dropping of the atomic bomb. And I've always found her story very, very interesting that she tells about that and about when they went back to school and what they had to do. So I encourage you to check that out. So as I said, Japan agrees to surrender 6 days after the dropping of the second atomic bomb, and this would become what is known as VJ Day. Japanese agreed to surrender if the Allies would allow the emperor to remain as the titular head of state, which he would, August 15th, 1945. And General MacArthur, he would receive Japan's formal surrender on September 2nd, 1945. And again, like I said before, MacArthur would actually stay over there and help administer Japan after World War II. Now, again, I said this question of the atomic bomb and whether or not we should have dropped it has been asked a lot throughout history. And there was a lot of discussion after the war as to whether or not it should be dropped. Harry Truman did not talk about his decision to drop the atomic bomb a lot. We only have really 2 times he really wrote down talking about his decision and why he made it. And this is one that he wrote in 1963, so a good bit after the war here. But in that, he said his reasoning, it was done to save 125,000 youngsters on the American side and 125 on the Japanese side from getting killed. And as Truman made it very clear several times after this event, he said, I have no regrets, and under the circumstance, I would do it again. And again, that's something for us to kind of question on our own and discuss what we think was right or wrong about this dropping of the atomic bomb. But with that, you have World War II is over as far as the battles go and that kind of thing. We're going to talk about over the next couple of days what the war looked like at home and a couple other things with that. But yeah, World War II is over, the largest war in human history, over kind of incredible to think about the actual results of the war, that you have tens and tens of millions of people dead as a result of World War II. And that's not, we haven't even gotten into talking about like the Holocaust and other atrocities that happened throughout the war effort there. So again, tomorrow we'll jump into talking about the war in reference to minorities and what the war looked like at home. Hope you have a great day.